Michael.
Hi, Jen.
Welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's always good to be back and talk with you.
Yeah, podcast number 2. So I don't think that we talked about this in the first one, Michael. I don't know if people were able to tell or not, but this is my first podcast, and it's yours as well, right?
It certainly is. In fact, I've never even heard a podcast. So, sort of like I've never listened to one, and now I are one.
No, we are. And so we are learning as we're going, and I think you and I are determined to get better as we go. So thank you to everyone who listened into the first one and is sticking with us. We are covering Chapter 3, Racial Zoning, and Chapter 4, Own Your Own Home this time. But I wanted to do just a quick recap before we transition into those from the preface and Chapter 1 and 2 that we covered from the first podcast. And so some of the big points that we hit on there were, starting out right away, we had Supreme Court decisions and the Fair Housing Act that essentially should have set the bar that housing discrimination is not only illegal, but, as the court said, a badge of slavery. And the Constitution mandates us to not allow segregation. Yet those decisions and that Fair Housing Act has not always been followed, as we will talk about. So one of the other major points of these first chapters is helping us understand the differences between de facto versus de jure segregation, and actually seeing that de jure segregation, or segregation established by law or public policy, took place across the country. Segregation wasn't just about keeping blacks out of white neighborhoods. It was actually about keeping whites as well out of black neighborhoods, all in the name sometimes of racial purity. And despite the Supreme Court ruling of separate and equal, there was no such thing. There was no equality in any of this. We had black ghettos formed by limiting options of where black people were allowed to live, and then forcing them essentially with no options but public housing, which was extremely dense with no to little amenities in some of the least desirable areas to live. So location, costs, and stigma impacted other things such as job opportunities and education and ability to accrue any type of equity or wealth, having lasting and even continued effects to this day. So that was kind of some big picture things that it took us through. And now we're getting into, in the next chapters here, some more detail of how that was implemented.
One of the things that I found interesting was when I started to read this Chapter 3, about the second or third sentence in the chapter says, racial integration declined steadily from 1880 to the mid-20th century, and it has mostly stalled since then. When I first looked at that, I honestly thought it said racial integration increased steadily from 1880 to the mid-20th century, and it has mostly stalled since then. I'd look again and go, well, wait a second, it was better, integration was better before 1880? Between the Civil War and 1880, it was better, and the fact of the matter is, it was better. It was better during that period of time. What happened was in 1877, apparently, the president withdrew federal troops that had been protecting African Americans, and suddenly it gave carte blanche to communities to go, oh, we're going back to segregation again. So it actually, segregation became more involved. Integration suffered during that period of time, and not just in the cities, because really, in a lot of cases, they weren't in the cities yet, but all throughout America, there was issues, and they gave all kinds of examples all over the country about the fact that suddenly it was open season on African Americans again.
You took that first line, but my favorite part that I highlighted from the beginning of that chapter, Michael, was a couple sentences before, where it says, we like to think of American history as a continuous march of progress towards greater freedom, greater equality, and greater justice. But sometimes we move backwards, dramatically so. And that was my favorite. That is what really highlighted for me of how true that is, and having to recognize that.
Honestly, when I read that, then the last sentence didn't seem to make sense. And then I went back and went, oh, no, decline steadily, because you're right. It should have been the other way. It should have increased steadily. We should have made progress during that period of time, not gone backwards. And part of it goes, too, like you said, in 1877, they pulled the federal troops, which ceased protecting African Americans. In every sense of the word. One of the things I thought was fascinating, too, was just how little progress we've made in some areas, and not to pick on our southern neighbors, but this guy, Benjamin Tillman, who led the Red Shirts in killing 10 African Americans for no other reason than being African American, led this massacre against them, and he ended up being a senator for 24 years, United States Senator for 24 years, and they put a statue up in the state capitol for him, and Clemson University, which is in South Carolina as well, named one of their halls after him. And in fact, named their football field after him at one time as well. I mean, this is horrible. Now, the fact of the matter is, some of those things have been changed, but interestingly enough, the name of the hall is still on there. It's still called Tillman Hall, because the state legislators haven't changed that yet. So even in today, they're still honoring a person who was responsible for leading a massacre in the 1870s.
Yeah. You mentioned after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, where some blacks were actually being able to find some real freedom and prosperity to be able to start rebuilding their lives, that was taken away. And it was in the South, as you said, there was this movement of continued just utter terrorism of black people. And when there wasn't terrorism, you had things like sharecropping and things of that nature. So you had this inevitable mass fleeing of black individuals from the South, trying to find places further up north where they would not necessarily have their very lives continue to be threatened. But in my mind, I thought that for the most part, blacks were able to find refuge in the North from the South. And to some degree, that is true. They were able to find some refuge from the outright violence that they were experiencing in the South. But there really was nowhere in the country where they were going to find a place where their constitutional rights were protected. And no matter where they went, they were finding communities who were outright banning African Americans from even residing within their borders. Before we even had the discussion of segregation, they weren't even allowed to be in a community's borders after dark sometimes.
Yeah. And I found that fascinating as well, that even though the African Americans had integrated into some communities, in fact, they picked out a couple in Montana, for example, where they had been integrated apparently peacefully, apparently successfully. And then when this all happened, it changed back again, where again, as you said, they weren't even allowed to be in town after dark. Had to be out of town by sundown. It's a remarkable change over time. Like you said, we'd like to think that we've made progress over time, but we certainly were going backwards during that period of time.
So we had de facto segregation.
Absolutely.
And then the book talks about how the point in time when we actually moved to de jure segregation, where the government is sponsoring the segregation.
And that kind of happened with Woodrow Wilson, which was a little bit surprising to me again. Woodrow Wilson obviously led us through the First World War as president. It said point blank that he was an uncompromising believer in segregation and black inferiority. In fact, when he was president of Princeton, he did not allow blacks to be admitted into Princeton. So it's interesting to think that as president, then he instituted that same thing in the government and had strict limitations on what types of positions black people could hold. And in some cases, they had to go backwards. They had been holding a position of some authority and had to give it up.
Yeah.
It definitely wasn't slight progress forward even, or even status quo. It was, we had to go backwards.
And where they couldn't, so even in government policy and positions in civil service, going backwards or trying to get rid of entirely African Americans who had been able to find success. They also had another big problem. And they had communities where you had populations of African Americans that were too large to be able to outright get rid of or expel like they did in Montana. So they had to go to Plan B, and that's where exclusionary zoning starts to be born. So you had R1 for white people and R2 for black people. R1 and R2 surely must sound familiar. I mean, it's changed and morphed to some degree over time, but we're still back to the modern day zoning. This is where it was started from.
And that was interesting to me to see that the whole concept of zoning started to keep neighborhoods racially segregated. Now, in 1917, the Supreme Court overruled a zoning ordinance in Louisville in the case of Buchanan versus Worley. And that was a big deal, except that nobody paid any attention to it. Or if they did, they tried to distinguish their facts from the facts in Buchanan. And in fact, it was interesting to see the various ways in which they tried to finagle their way around the Buchanan case. One of them was, well, that talked about who could own the property. It didn't talk about who could live there. Mm-hmm. So we're going to say we're different than that Supreme Court case. It doesn't apply to us because we're talking about who can live here, not who can own the property. And reality, of course, is that there's not a whole lot of difference with regard to that. That's what we found, is people looking for one way or another to get around that Supreme Court ruling. So once again, we have de jure saying, you can't do this, and de facto is, we're going to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that, Michael. One Supreme Court decision, and I know you're going to love this. We need to talk about this because you're an attorney. And it may seem at first blush, as you're listening to us talk about this court case, of saying, well, good for the Supreme Court. Well, at least they understood the constitutional and moral implications of segregated zoning. But the truth of the matter is, they came to that conclusion by looking at the 14th Amendment, not as something to protect the free slaves, but as a business rule, freedom of contract, which also resulted from that court decision in eliminating minimum wage and workplace safety laws. So it was, in some regards, one step forward, two steps back.
I don't disagree with you at all, and the reality there is some of the problems that were caused in the first place were because of the Supreme Court in 1896, in the famous Plessy versus Ferguson, which is one of the worst decisions they've ever come to grips with. So in Plessy versus Ferguson, that's where they came down with separate but equal. So here we're trying to say, okay, maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't have that be the way it is. The Supreme Court then and Atlanta tried to get around it with their zoning. The Georgia Supreme Court rejected the argument, finding that the plan was unconstitutional, but nobody fought, but nobody cared. It didn't change anything. Even though the Supreme Court of Georgia said, that's unconstitutional, Atlanta said, yeah, whatever, we're going to do it anyway. And they kept doing it, and no one, and one case after another in here is like either the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court said, oh, you can't do that, and they said, well, we're going to do it anyway. So
Louisville, Richmond, Virginia, Birmingham, Austin, West Palm Beach, Orlando, Kansas, and Norfolk, they continued to ignore the Buchanan decision all the way up until 1987.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Palm Beach didn't change until 1960. An area outside Orlando didn't change until 68. Kansas City and Norfolk, 1987, just like you said. These are not ancient Civil War things that were happening. These were happening during our lifetime. Well, during my lifetime anyway, maybe not everybody's. So it was interesting to see that in some cases, even when the court did make appropriate rulings, nobody paid any attention to it and nobody followed up to enforce it.
Yep. So not everybody completely ignored the Buchanan decision, Michael. So that must mean that the rest of the country took that cue and moved forward and desegregated their communities and supported integration. Say that tongue-in-cheek. Actually,
of course,
for the rest of the country who decided not to outright defy the Supreme Court decision, they came up with Plan C, which was economic zoning, or for the most part, what we would call today Euclidean zoning, where you are breaking all the uses or all the land use zones based on use. So you have residential and the various forms of residential, and you have manufacturing and industrial and commercial and public institutional uses, etc., which we still use today.
And I know you and I don't agree 100% on this, although we do 100% agree on how it began, how it started, that it started as a way to get around flat-out racial segregation in zoning. They set it up in such a way so that they said, well, this is going to be zoned for single-family housing. However, in this area, all the deeds are going to have restrictions that are going to keep out the black people. In fact, some of those deeds exist today.
Let's go back to that, Michael, because we do talk a little bit more about financing and how that came into play with those deeds. But I do want to talk a little bit more about this type of economic zoning or Euclidean zoning. I don't think most people would argue, even to this day, that it is important to have some separation between certain types of uses, manufacturing, industrial, certain types of commercial uses. But under the zoning that they had at that time to try and maintain segregation, they ended up using that type of zoning to, one, preserve white suburbs and neighborhoods. And then they also used it, though, not to just segregate Black people, but to deteriorate the neighborhoods that were designated for Black people by going against their own zoning rules and locating things such as toxic manufacturing areas or bars and houses of prostitution and things of that nature. So not only was there the stigma that Black people couldn't live in white neighborhoods and even whites couldn't live in Black neighborhoods, but whatever value and quality of life that the Black neighborhoods had without all of the nice amenities of white neighborhoods, now you're going to significantly increase the density and you're going to locate very undesirable uses in it, essentially turning those neighborhoods into ghettos or slums.
That's exactly what happened. By using the economic aspect, they basically still said, okay, this is only for single-family residences, but nobody could own single-family residence except for white people for a couple of reasons. One, because many of them had restrictive deeds that wouldn't allow Black people or any non-white person. And in fact, we're talking about separation on the races, but in some cases, they're talking also about immigrants from other areas as well, from Italy, from Eastern European countries, even from Ireland. People were discriminated against on these bases as well. So it didn't matter what it was. There was no way that a Black person could buy into this, even if the zoning would allow them to do that. The restrictions on the deeds, as well as the fact that they couldn't get a loan.
Now we're at a point where Black families are not able to afford to get out of these neighborhoods for the most part into a single family home. And as long as white single family neighborhoods would not allow multifamily, which was the only option for housing that Black people could afford, it was the perfect solution of keeping Black people from ever being able to integrate into white, mainly suburban areas.
But it also had the effect of what you said, of keeping Black families in areas where they were also mixed in with other types of uses, such as commercial uses, industrial uses, like you said before, taverns and even houses of prostitution, but also toxic waste areas, garbage. And this was going on, according to the book, the situation in 1991 in North Carolina. The county had 3 existing landfills, all in African-American areas. A new landfill was proposed for a white area. The residents protested. They didn't issue a permit. They came up with another proposal, this time in an African-American area. Again, the residents protested. They said, nah, we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
That was in 91.
Now that particular example that the book was using, Michael, was talking about something that's more of toxic zoning, where it's not just undesirable or incompatible uses like commercial or manufacturing. It's actual things like incinerators and waste dumps being located right within African American neighborhoods. And so now we're not just talking about social stigma or economic effects of zoning. Now we're affecting their very health.
Absolutely.
We had in the late 20th century another development that furthers the situation with the advent of FHA developing the insured amortized mortgage as a way to promote home ownership nationwide, but at the same time rendering African Americans ineligible because banks and the FHA decided that all of the stuff that they located in those Black neighborhoods, the undesirable uses, created too much risk for property value. And without the ability to get the FHA-backed mortgage, the way white people were, it effectively cost African Americans. Their housing is going to be a lot more expensive than that of similar housing in white neighborhoods. Leaving, then, again, the domino effect, the owners in Black neighborhoods with fewer resources when they actually could afford to own their own home. Because it was more expensive, they had fewer resources for upkeep, making their homes more likely to deteriorate, reinforcing this entire neighborhood slum stigma that we attached to Black areas.
Yeah, the FHA, the loans that they were offering to white people, but not to Black people, actually started in the late 30s. So, and it continued on for some time. By 68, they were not able to make those distinctions anymore because of the Fair Housing Act applied to financing as well as to other areas. But again, even though Johnson signed that law into effect in 1968, and this isn't in the book specifically, but they still had issues, they still had problems with redlining. They do talk a little bit about the redlining in the book. I think it's in chapter 4 where they talk more about redlining, where they would actually, in making loans, they would look and see if you're in a high-risk area or not. So even though Johnson's Fair Housing Act of 1968 said you can't do this anymore, they still said, oh, well, we're not really doing that. We're just looking at the risks that are involved. And that's where you look at the map and go, yes, but you have a disparate effect or impact on black families. You can look at the map all day long and say this is neutral. The reality is it's not neutral at all. The impact is disparate, and that affects black families more than anything else. So this is still going on even in the late 20th century. Yeah. It was still happening.
It's jaw-dropping to me, though, Michael, even just that one element that we were talking about. FHA is essentially, we're saying this is where the secondary government-backed mortgage market developed. I mean, we're still using it today. It is where the vast majority of our mortgages rely on.
Our government-backed still.
Being able to make them affordable and to have that distinction that they would not be made available to black people. Again, you have this momentous event that helps develop a white middle class, allowing white people to realize that American dream, being able to move forward, to advance their standard of living, and you completely leave the black community behind.
And that kind of takes us into the next chapter of Own Your Own Home.
I want to talk a little bit first, though, about the advisory committee on zoning that was made up essentially of all of the outspoken segregationists who were heads of planning institutions as well as the National Real Estate Board. Yeah. 2 years, they developed a manual. And 2 years after this manual was developed, the Association of Real Estate Boards adopted a code of ethics. And this code of ethics included a warning that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So the Realtors Association's first code of ethics essentially prohibited realtors from selling a home in a black neighborhood to a white person, but more importantly, selling a home in a white neighborhood to an African American.
Obviously, our code of ethics has changed since that time. Article 10 now addresses that pretty specifically and makes it very clear that you can't do anything along those lines. But we were certainly part of the problem in those days. There's no question about it. It was part of the de jure part of the segregation. And certainly the National Association of Real Estate Boards is not the government, but it's quasi-governmental because many of the institutions that were able to make loans looked at realtors to provide them with appraisals. And as I said a minute ago, part of that was, what's the risk? If you had black families in or near even, the risk got higher.
Yeah. And we talk about that, which is what we're transitioning to is chapter 4, Own Your Own Home. This chapter is really looking at the limits that race-based zoning created in not allowing blacks to move into neighborhoods even when they could afford it. The federal government wanted to encourage white flight, essentially, out of denser urban areas and advertising the ability for them to be able to own their own home, primarily out in new residential developed areas. And I have an interesting story, Michael, that this chapter reminded me of. I was recently visiting friends in upper state New York, and they were telling me how they had a little bit of a harrowing experience with their U-Haul, in that there are these overpasses over the main roads leading out of the central city of New York into the suburbs, and were afraid that they weren't going to have enough clearance to get even their U-Haul through these underpasses. And that the reason for this was they were specifically designed to have height limits on them so that city buses when city buses were the primary mode of transportation of the Black community, that the Black community would not be able to live out in the suburbs because they would not be able to take the buses from inner city New York out into the residential areas. And these underpasses exist to this day.
I had never heard that story before, and I find that fascinating. It's another example of finding ways to circumvent what the de jure approach is, saying the law says we have to do this, but the de facto aspect of it is it ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
De facto is we're going to find a way around that. And if it's to build bridges that the buses can't go under to keep Black people from commuting, then that's what they're going to do. It's interesting how many different ways that people have found to continue with segregation.
The evidence of all of this, you don't have to read a book on history. The examples still exist to this day, from universities that have halls named after a white supremacist who had mass execution of African Americans.
Who had been indicted for murder by the local court, but nothing was ever done.
No, and overpasses that still don't allow public buses to get out of New York City. But we have 1917, Wilson's Department of Labor promoted capitalism through homeownership, stating it's your patriotic duty to cease renting. So you flip this on its head. So essentially it's also saying, so all Blacks who couldn't afford to own their homes are essentially unpatriotic and less American. And then you have Hoover in 1921 establishing better homes in American exclusionary zoning. Ford, Calvin Coolidge, and Roosevelt were all involved in this organization, encouraging ethnic and racial homogeneity by considering people in each neighborhood and developing a manual where apartments were termed the worst kind of housing, frequently overcrowded because of the, quote, ignorant racial habit of African Americans. We had the Department of Commerce list home buying tips, of course using a good realtor. And then also restricted residential districts may serve as protections against persons whom your family won't care to associate, and provided the restrictions are enforced and not merely temporary.
You know, one of the things I found interesting was back when we did the Own Your Own Home campaign, the Department of Labor printed over 2 million posters to be hung up, and all of them had images of white families and white couples and white buyers. Now, the reason I find that interesting, because again, that was 1917, so you wouldn't probably find that too unusual in that time frame, but as recently as 20 years ago, that was still being an issue, and there have been lawsuits in Baltimore and Cincinnati with regard to the fact that they found that to be de facto discrimination, because if you put out advertising, consistently put out advertising that doesn't reflect the makeup of the environment that you're in, then that is going to be de facto discrimination. So we've kind of switched back the other direction, but that kind of stuff's still happening, today. And
finally, it wraps up. The committee chair on financing home ownership published a report. This is a government agency, recommended zoning laws be supplemented by deed restrictions to prevent, quote, incompatible ownership occupancies. This was the start of what you were talking about, Michael, where even the zoning laws weren't enough to prevent the horrendous outcome that the government felt would be integrated neighborhoods. There was only one committee in that entire conference devoted to Negro housing, and all of their recommendations were ignored.
That goes across not just FHA and the government there, but also when they couldn't get loans from banks, they could also get loans from insurance companies, and the insurance companies had the same rules. And in fact, the president of Metropolitan Life Insurance Company was the one that came up with the idea that you do want to prevent incompatible ownership occupancy. I found it fascinating. When I first started practicing law back in 1978, I was looking at deeds, and I saw the deed restrictions. I thought several times, what an interesting way to word these things. They tried to word them nicely, but the discrimination was still the same.
The effect.
And the same thing here, they're trying to find nice ways of saying no black families.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter how you write it, it comes out the same.
Yeah. They were very good, Michael. I mean, they found just about every loophole or pathway that the African American community could try and find some way to thrive and get out of poverty. And they closed it. And they put up roadblocks in every single possible circumstance. And not only that, just stopping African Americans from being able to get out of their current situation, but making sure that white Americans were able to thrive and surge way ahead.
And to add insult to injury, many of the restrictive covenants said things along the lines of, this property shall only be owned and occupied by persons of the Caucasian persuasion other than household staff, gardeners, etc. So they would say, well, it's okay to have black people here as long as they are, working for you, but they can't occupy or live in.
Despite all of these efforts that they had, by Roosevelt's New Deal, after 14 years of promoting home ownership for white middle-income American citizens, they still had achieved very little because it was prohibitively expensive to own your own home, even for white working-class families. So it was prohibitively expensive for working-class families. Mortgages required at that time 50% down. They were interest-only payments with only 5 to 7 year notes. And then the Depression came along, making things much worse, and we start actually seeing foreclosures rather than increasing in white family home ownership. So the Roosevelt administration, through the New Deal, tries to help these individuals in making payments, try and keep them out of foreclosure, but also finding a way to increase first-time home ownership for the middle class. In and of itself, I'm sure that the majority of the country was cheering these efforts. What could possibly be wrong with the government, especially under such severe economic conditions, trying to help people become first-time homebuyers and helping to try and make mortgages more affordable? But it rang parallel, all of this, to an article. It was included in one of my Friday reports about what we're experiencing right now with the housing crisis and the difficulty of people trying to become first-time homebuyers. And the name of the article was Fair Housing Cannot Take a Back Seat to Build, Baby Build. And the article states, existing inequalities and inequities should not be overlooked in the extraordinary need to build more affordable housing for everyone. And again, it's this concept of we cannot create situations and policies, no matter how great the need is, if the entire framework is going to end up creating inequities and leaving behind minority populations while advancing even further the ability of white people to achieve home ownership.
Well, that's exactly what was happening in 1933 when the Homeowners Loan Corporation started and was making new mortgages to homeowners, white homeowners, basically saving them from being foreclosed upon because of the depression that we had at that time. However, they were not extended. That type of protections were not extended to black families. In fact, they hired realtors at that time to provide appraisals. And of course, the appraisals... Who
are abiding by the racist code of ethics.
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the reasons they liked using realtors was because we had ethics that said you cannot sell homes in white neighborhoods to black families. They were going out and appraising properties based on their own code of ethics, as well as the fact that that's exactly what they were looking for.
And this is where the color-coded maps were created based on, quote, safe properties or risky properties for maintaining valuation. And red were risky properties, which were African American neighborhoods.
Or even near an African neighborhood.
Yep. And it didn't matter. The African American neighborhoods were color-coded red, even if it was a solid middle-class income neighborhood where property values were being maintained. Essentially, if you boil it down at the end of the day, we have the federal government saying that African Americans are poor risks based solely on their race.
And in fact, interestingly enough, the biggest lawsuit settlement in the history of Wisconsin with regard to fair housing is a redlining case involving an insurance company in Milwaukee. $14.5 million settlement in the 90s. FHA came along in 1934 and provided additional assistance and some oversight. Their oversight was racial segregation was required. The FHA provided the underwriters with a manual that said if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. And that's part of the manual put out by FHA. So there's your de jure segregation once again.
So that was another game changer. There was the Homeowner Loan Corporation, and then there was FHA. But the thing that was very striking to me, Michael, was not just the implications of FHA only providing mortgage backing for only single-family white individual mortgages, but that FHA then became the source of backing the lending and the mortgages for entire new subdivisions, newly built suburban homes, and that most developers would not be able to afford to do a subdivision, anywhat affordable to middle-income individuals without it. And if they wanted it, they had to agree to not allow the sales of any of those new homes to African Americans.
And in fact, FHA discouraged banks from making loans in urban neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. They not only did they say we're promoting this, we're actively discouraging that. And they said we're going to encourage these new developments in the suburban areas, but that's white only. We're going to discourage loans to in urban areas, which would be predominantly black families.
And they even led their walls back then, Michael. Build the wall. Only here it was building the wall between African American neighborhoods and white neighborhoods.
That was Detroit.
To make sure that they were safe, right? There was all about safety and protecting those white neighborhoods from the very unsafe black neighborhoods.
In fact, that neighborhood did not qualify for getting a loan until the developer built the wall, 6 foot high, 1 foot wide concrete wall from one end to the other. And then they reapplied and they said, oh, now it's okay because now you've been separated. And in fact, in many cases, separation by highways made the difference.
Yep.
So that was, we don't want anybody too close together. So,
or one side of the river or the other.
Or one side of railroad tracks or the other. And that was the big one, the railroad track one. In fact, the neighborhood, to this day, the neighborhood still remain predominantly black and predominantly white. Even though the community around there as a whole are different, but that in that particular community, it's still the way it started, it's still the way it is today. And that's where we have the de jure becomes de facto, which it continues on into today's world.
And FHA wasn't just concerned about maintaining segregation in residential areas. They also were very concerned about preventing school desegregation. Because as they stated, black children represent a far lower level of society, unquote.
I like all the examples they give in the book. It's really cool to read the actual examples. Fanwood, New Jersey, 1941, is a development outside of Newark. A developer tried to sell 12 new properties to middle-class African Americans, all had good credit ratings. The banks were willing to issue mortgages, but only if the FHA would approve. The agency said no loans will be given to colored developments. That was 1941. They said today, even though that's not no longer the case, today Fanwood remains 5% black in a country where the black population is 25%. So the fact that happened in 1941, the remnants are still here today. And I think that's something we see throughout this book, is how it started and how it just has continued on.
Yep.
And certainly we're no different in Wisconsin. Milwaukee is still considered the most segregated large city in America.
I loved the personal story that they gave of the school teacher in Georgia that they spoke to today, who can trace her family history back to her uncle, Vince Meriday, who was a veteran, a small business owner, and he delivered drywall to these subdivisions but wasn't allowed to own a home in one of those subdivisions, despite the fact that he was a qualified borrower. And in fact, wherever he was allowed to buy, he had to have a much higher down payment and interest rate than other veterans in their mortgages, leaving him, as the book says, permanently embittered. And I'm quoting from the book, in the decades following World War II, suburbs across the country, as in Milk Pass and Palo Alto and Levittown, were created in this way, with FHA administering an explicit racial policy that solidified segregation in every one of our metropolitan areas. And you have one family after another who can probably go back and trace what these policies did to their families, not just economically, but emotionally and psychologically, and how that carried through.
And the history they give of the Meredith family is interesting because it looks at several different members of the family over the time and how it affected each of them in different ways, but basically all in the same way. And that was they couldn't live where they could afford to live. They couldn't live where they wanted to live, only because of one thing, because of the color of their skin.
And that they were inferior as human beings because of their race. So we will talk all day long about veterans coming home with trauma. And for this particular veteran, he probably had, at the end of the day, and especially as this niece is recalling, a lot more trauma just from what he experienced in his own country.
They show a photograph. A Veterans Administration subsidized development for veterans coming back from the war. A huge sign says, "This track is exclusive and restricted," meaning no blacks. And again, that was in 1950, which is, I hate to say it, but again, that's my lifetime that we're talking about, that this was still going on, this was happening. So these aren't things that were a long time ago.
So we see this pattern emerge of government commitment to separating residential areas by race, following the suppression of the Reconstruction period and continuing across the country to this day. The 1920s Harding administration promoting zoning ordinances that distinguished single-family from multifamily districts with the purpose of preventing racial integration. Same time, Hoover administration conducting propaganda campaigns directed at all white middle-class families, persuading them to move out of apartments and into single-family homes. The Roosevelt administration creating maps over metro areas, dividing into zones of foreclosure risk based on race of occupants, and then ensuring white homeowner mortgages if they lived in all white neighborhoods where there was no danger of blacks moving in. After World War II, the federal government further spurred suburbanization of every metro area by guaranteeing bank loans to mass production builders who created all white subdivisions and in entire suburbs ringing American cities. And then we conclude with the 1973 U.S. Commission on Civil Rights concluding that, quote, "The housing industry, aided and abetted by government, must bear the primary responsibility for the legacy of segregated housing. Government and private industry came together to create a system of residential segregation."
And even as progress was being made in the eyes of the FHA, it was still along the lines of, we're just now going to approve loans in nicer segregated neighborhoods. That's what they viewed as being progress. And in fact, in New Orleans, they had the case where they said that they did develop they couldn't get loans for the middle-class black professionals in one area that had whites, so they developed another area for them and include certain amenities, and they thought, this is the type of thing that the FHA wants. They think that's progress. We're going to keep segregation, we're just going to make it a little bit nicer than it was before. And it's still not progress.
Next chapters, Michael, the third podcast will be concentrating on Chapter 5, which is private agreements, government enforcement, and Chapter 6, which is white flight. We kind of teased some of these topics, and if the book is following a similar format, we'll be getting into much more detail and specific facts and information behind these trends.
I can see blockbusting coming up in these next two chapters. It's hard to talk about one thing without seeing how it progresses into the next. But we'll continue to talk about this the next two chapters in 2 weeks.
Perfect.